Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another IEEE USA Livestream webinar, Starting Your Journey Towards Healthy Financial Habits. I'm your host, Jonathan Cho. This is the third webinar in our financial literacy series in partnership with IEEE member discounts. For more information on the previous and upcoming ones in the series, you can check them out through the link that we'll be providing in the live chat and comments section shortly. IEEE USA's goal is to create programming that is valuable, relevant, and of interest to you. As such, we will be sending a short survey to all registrants after this event and would love your feedback. We value your opinions and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes and share your thoughts. Our presenter for today's webinar is Brian Walsh from SoFi. Brian leads financial planning and education efforts at SoFi. His insights are featured in publications including the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, Forbes, the New York Times, and more. He's also a PhD candidate in Kansas State University's Personal Financial Planning Program and is a certified financial planner professional. Without further ado, I will now pass it off to our presenter. Welcome, Brian. We're very excited for what you have for our audience today.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Excited to kind of go through this topic today. We're really focusing on starting your journey towards healthy financial habits. And I guess when I come up with titles for presentations, I might be a little bit hesitant to use the word starting because really what we want to talk through looking at today is how do we, no matter where we're at in our financial journey, whether it be just getting started, kind of halfway through, even later on, getting closer to retirement, it's how do we really start to put a framework in place to really go after the financial goals that are important to us. And then wanted to dive a little bit deeper into a couple areas that we see coming up on a regular basis. So that's really going to be the focus of today. Quick background, already got mentioned. I'm Brian Walsh. I lead financial planning at SoFi. For those of you unaware, we are a digital personal finance company. We offer complimentary financial planning to our members. And leading that team, what we try to do is we take those insights, take those conversations, best practices, and then use that to inform the educational content through a webinar like this. Some quick disclosures before I dive in so I keep myself out of trouble. I am a certified financial planner. Important to keep in mind that nothing I talk about today should be looked at as financial advice. Best to think about it as high-level education, guidance, things like that. It's always going to vary. There's going to be exceptions to what I say depending on your unique circumstances. So really kind of just look at this as a high-level framework that you could use going through prioritizing your finances and the different areas that I'm going to touch on. So for today's topic, really want to start with the foundational aspects, kind of looking at it like best practices that we've seen work well with individuals when working one-on-one or even in a group-based setting. We've done different education courses, things like that. What are some best practices we could put in place when it comes to approaching finances, prioritizing the different goals that we have, and then really kind of breaking this down to set it up so we are in a good position to achieve financial goals. And then the second two parts before transitioning to comments and questions would be the two key areas that we see coming up over the last probably 3 to 6 months, especially given what's going on with interest rates increasing, with cost of living, different things like that. We've seen much more of an emphasis on different ways to understand and improve your credit score, and then also prioritize when you should prioritize, how you can manage, pay down debt, best use of debt, things along those lines. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to drop them in the comments or live chat, and we will leave some time towards the tail end to answer any questions, which selfishly I have to admit, that's my favorite part of all this, because we get great questions and allows to provide responses there, because if one person asks a question, I can almost guarantee there's a handful of people that have very, very similar question that just didn't ask it. So as we think about finances and building out that framework and best practices, there's a handful of different things that we've discovered that really matter much more than other things. There's always going to be the headlines, all the things that get our attention, whether it be on social media, the news, talking to friends and family. But what we've uncovered is there's a handful of things that really drive whether or not people have, really healthy financial habits where they can kind of set and forget their finances and progress towards their goals, versus people who ultimately kind of, struggle. Maybe it's kind of, you go through a good spot financially and then you kind of fall off, and it's kind of like a game of chutes and ladders. And a lot of that is the framework, the approach, the system that people have in place that tends to make that process a lot easier. So what I want to hit on with this is what's a simple way to approach spending, because at a high level, how you spend your money, what comes in versus what goes out, really kind of drives your overall finances and how you can accomplish your goals. How we can focus and prioritize financial goals, and then how we can kind of take that and say there's a bunch of different things that we could focus on, whether it be paying down debt, saving for retirement, saving for an emergency, whatever it is. What are some things that we could do to make those goals more achievable? So the first piece is really focusing on the cash flow side of things, because that's one of the areas where, I mean, unless, someone is, let's say already retired and, living off the money they saved or a pension or Social Security or whatever type of income they have coming in, how someone manages their money going out compared to their money going in is really going to determine how financially secure they're going to be, how quickly they could achieve financial independence, and really what type of financial options they're going to have. And a lot of times, one of the most common questions we'll get when it comes to trying to figure out how we can approach finances is, what's the best approach to, saving money, spending money, all of that stuff? What's the best approach to budgeting? How should I organize this type of stuff? And what we found over the years is that simplicity tends to be better, whether it be on how we're organizing our finances or how we're going after our financial goals. Sometimes it's natural to overcomplicate things. But the simpler we can make it, the more repeatable it could be, the less time we spend on it. And that can make all the difference in whether or not people stick with a plan of attack towards, starting and building healthy financial habits. So from a high level, we encourage a simple approach to how we organize our spending. And that's the 50-30-20 rule of budgeting, where essentially the 50-30-20 rule says, okay, we got $100 coming in, 50% of that, so $50 would go towards our essential expenses. Think rent or your mortgage payment, loan payments, groceries, childcare, things like that. The things that you truly have to spend in order to survive. And then we'd have 30% of our spending, ideally, going towards discretionary items. So think things that, I don't know, really bring you joy and make life, pleasurable and awesome. But if push came to shove, ultimately you could do without. So in this example, we'd have $30 every single month going towards things like dining out, gym memberships, shopping, discretionary type things like that. And then most importantly, 20% of the overall money coming in would go towards goals. Now that could be saving, let's say building, saving up money in a savings account to cover unexpected expenses. It could be investing for the future. It could be extra payments on debt, whatever it ends up being. And we at a high level encourage that simple approach of saying, 50% towards essentials, 30% towards discretionary, and then most importantly, that 20% towards our goals. And what people can do is they're going through their finances to figure out whether or not this can make sense or be achievable, is start by looking backwards and say, okay, how has my money been spent in the past? Where does this break up between the 50, the 30, and the 20 categories? And sometimes going through that process, you'll identify, hey, here's some areas I can cut down on my expenses. Here's some waste, quite frankly, where maybe I'll use myself as an example. I think at one point I had Disney Plus, Amazon, Netflix, and Hulu at the same time. And I'm like, okay, I really don't need those. And it helps you kind of build out how you can go forward with that 50-30-20 approach to building out how you're going to spend your money or allocate that money that you have coming in. So that's really the first step, is establishing that high level framework for how money is going to be spent on an ongoing basis. The next foundational item that we found was really, really impactful to people. Once they have a good understanding of where their money's going, they have a plan for kind of, okay, here's where that 20% should be going towards the goals, is something that's a little bit less obvious to a lot of people. And that's how they choose to focus on their financial goals. And what we've seen over the years is people have a lot of different things in their financial lives that get attention. So going through a common example, it's like, okay, someone needs to increase their savings to have enough money to handle an unexpected expense. Maybe they need to save more money, to be able to retire, pay down some credit card debt, or pay down a personal loan. And a lot of people we work with start off by just kind of spreading money out. Like in this example, saying, hey, maybe $100 a month goes towards the emergency fund, 200 towards the 401k, 100 towards a credit card, 100 towards a personal loan. And that's fantastic because at the end of the day, there's $500 a month going towards your financial goals and your financial future. The challenge we found with that is kind of with, like, I would call it the scattershot approach, is you take a long time to start making progress. And so it takes a long period of time in order to celebrate wins and to see that you're gaining traction along the way. And what we realized is, if we're all robots, it wouldn't matter. But we need to be able to try to figure out how we can keep ourselves on the track once we start going. And a simple way to do that would be to narrow your focus and say, okay, instead of focusing on 4 different things at a time, let's put that $500 a month towards one thing. Because when we put it towards one thing, we're going to see progress. And ultimately, when it comes to financial goals, progress leads to persistence, which is what gets people to accomplish something, because it can take a long time to accomplish a lot of these financial goals that we work with people on. So instead of the spread out approach on the left-hand side of the screen, we encourage people to take that $500 and say, okay, let's pick one thing and let's focus on that whole $500 with that one thing. So that way we can really motivate ourselves to keep going along the way. Now, the biggest pushback, admittedly, as we started working through this with people and really encouraging people to focus on one thing at a time, was the idea of, they're like, okay, if we focus on one thing, what if we focus on the wrong thing? And that's an extremely valid question, a valid concern, because maybe if you focus on the wrong thing, it could expose you to some additional risk. So the next aspect that we kind of look at as like a foundational aspect of healthy financial habits is saying, okay, if we're going to focus on one thing, let's say we follow the 50-30-20 approach, we got 20% going towards our goals. We're going to focus all that 20% on one goal. Let's be sure we pick the right goal at the right time, so that way we set ourselves up for long-term success. We kind of view this as kind of like a simple step-by-step process of saying, okay, go through each item. Like, let's say we start with number 1 and asking yourself, do I have this taken care of? And if you do, then you move on to the next one until you find one where the answer is no. And that would be the goal to focus on for all of that attention. So how we prioritize all these different things that need to eventually be accomplished in our financial lives is, starting number 1, the most important thing in our minds is a safety net. And really, when I say a safety net, it functions just as that. It's kind of like the safety net between something happening unexpectedly in life and being in a very, very tough financial position. So in our mind, that would be 1 month's worth of expenses set aside in cash. So it could be a checking account, savings account, things like that. So focusing there and saying, okay, do I have 1 month's worth of expenses set aside in cash? If the answer is no, then that would be the area that we would focus on. And if the answer is yes, we move on. Number 2 would be taking full advantage of an employer match. At the end of the day, an employer match is one of the few times as a financial planner I can say the words free and money in the same sentence, and it's completely legitimate. Ultimately, an employer match is an extremely valuable part of total compensation, and it really adds up over a longer period of time. Sometimes it may seem small, like, okay, maybe I have a 2% match, 3% match, whatever it may be. But if you multiply that out over years and decades, that adds up to a ton of money when it comes down to it when we look at retirement. So we'd be looking at saying, hey, are we taking full advantage of any employer matches that we have available? Number three would be income protection. So income protection is just looking at saying, if something happens, let's say I get sick or injured and I can't go to work, or if I pass away prematurely, uh, is my family and myself, am I still going to be okay? So typically we look at disability insurance to protect income. We would look at life insurance, having enough in place to protect against a premature death. Also, we'd look at property and casualty insurance, things like that, to make sure we're protecting all those risks. One of the key caveats here when I talk about life insurance is we'll typically look at term life insurance because by and large that ends up being the most cost-effective way to protect against passing away prematurely and still having things in order for your loved ones that rely on your income. So that would be number three. Hey, do I have this in place? If not, focus on it. If you do. Number four would be attacking bad debt. And bad debt would be any sort of debt that comes with a high interest rate. We categorize it as over 7%. And typically that's used to accelerate kind of consumption, like credit cards, personal loans, auto loans, things like that. At the end of the day, that becomes really costly to maintain. And if we're just making minimum payments, it really kind of takes away from the progress we make over time. So this would be the time to tackle that. It wouldn't be tackling all debt, trying to pay off all debt as quickly as possible, like, I don't know, a mortgage at 3% or a student loan that's got a super low rate. And step number four would be attacking that bad debt only that comes with higher interest rates. And we'll touch on some strategies that we've seen work recently in the third section of today. Step number five is emergency fund, which is really a bigger version of a safety net. So instead of 1 month's worth of expenses, typically we'll see 3 to 6 months worth of expenses set aside in cash. 3 months if income is stable, maybe you're in a dual income household. 6 months if your income is less stable, maybe there's bonus or commission or anything like that, or if you're in a single income household. And again, this would be in checking, savings, things like that. And we definitely encourage people not to invest this money in the stock market because it can introduce a lot of risk. Step number six would be saving for retirement and really prioritizing extra savings above what's required to take full advantage of that employer match. Generally, like the rule of thumb in our mind is like, hey, 15% is a good starting point for the average person to retire and kind of keep up with their standard of living. There's always exceptions though. So there's people who have to save less money, and then there's people who have to save more money. We kind of just use that as a good starting point before diving in and figuring out what exactly needs to be saved. Number seven would be all the other goals we have. Sometimes people have no goals outside of retirement. Sometimes they have a lot of goals, like sending their kids to college, taking certain vacations, buying, rental property, different things like that. And then step number eight would be good debt that quite frankly is cost effective or cheap to maintain, like a low interest rate mortgage or a low interest rate student loan or some auto loans, depending on when you borrowed the money. So that's how we kind of go through, and we start with saying, okay, we got 20% going towards our goals. We're going to focus on one goal, and then we use this framework to really pick the right goal at the right time and then move on when that's accomplished. Lastly, on the habits side of things is really diving into, no matter which one of those 8 steps that people are focused on, there's certain things that you can do to help set yourself up for success to get through that goal or that step as quickly as possible. And what we found is there's a handful of things that really make a difference. Number one is focusing on micro goals. And that's just the general idea of like these goals can be really big, like saving 15% for retirement. Like, that's huge, especially if you're starting at like 3%. We're not going to go from 3% to 15% overnight most of the time. So let's focus on something that's accomplishable in the next, let's say 30, 60, or 90 days. So that way we can just kind of rinse and repeat. A lot of times when people focus on breaking down financial goals into like short-term sprints and then repeat it, it's something that feels realistic and doable, and they're more likely to actually go after it. Next thing would be understanding what things actually drive whether or not you're going to be successful. I guess I'll use myself as an example. I struggle with impulse purchases. That is like the make or break thing on whether or not I go through the 3 month stretch that I focus on a particular goal. Whether I achieve it or don't, 9 times out of 10, it's whether or not I was, good with impulse purchases. So it sounds silly. I had to take the Amazon app off of my phone because I simply made too many purchases that pushed me over the threshold. Everyone has different drivers. Maybe it's associating with friends that travel more than you can afford to, or it's on social media, or it's online shopping, whatever it may be. Let's pick that out and then ultimately kind of hedge away from that a little bit. You'll want to check in, review as you need to, not only to make sure that you're on track, but then also that becomes like a reward system where you get positive reinforcement when you check in and you're on the right path. Then you get to kind of reward yourself internally and say, hey, I'm doing great. Let's keep going. And that helps people stay on track better. Another thing that we saw too is the idea of automation. I'm a huge fan of technology. I work at a financial technology company, because automating financial aspects of your life is really a way to kind of take human behavior out of it as much as possible. Where you go in there and you set something up and you make that good decision one time, and then it just keeps going, as opposed to forcing yourself to say, hey, every month I'm going to go in there and I'm going to manually save a certain amount of money. The odds are every time you have to go in there and take that action, you're going to be less likely to do it. So if you just automate as much as possible, that kind of avoids relying on your willpower. And then lastly, making sure goals are realistic. This is much more important to people who are just starting or changing financial behavior. You never want to be in a position where you set a goal that's really, really big. That's great, but it's completely unrealistic. And then you kind of fail. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to ignore this for a year or two and then hop back into it. So it's finding that balancing act to make sure it's a solid goal to work towards, but at the same time, something that can be built on in the future. Because again, we're focusing on kind of like 1 to 3 month sprints when we're looking at breaking up financial goals. So those are like the key foundational items that we've seen be effective for people across their financial journeys, whether they're just starting out, they're towards the tail end. And those best practices can really be applied to all sorts of different financial goals. Now, what I wanted to do was dive into a couple areas that, quite frankly, we've seen are much more impactful now as opposed to, let's say, 6 or 12 months ago, as far as people's kind of like day-to-day making tactical decisions on how they're managing their finances. The first one of those being related to people's credit and credit score. Now, this is an area where I go back and forth on my view towards credit scores, because I think they are extremely important. At the same time, they're not the be all and end all as far as someone's financial health. So it's about figuring out how do we make sure we focus on our credit scores enough that we have good overall use of our credit and debt and those types of things, without obsessing over it. And what we found is there's some key things that we could focus on, some key things we could try to avoid that have helped people not only understand their credit score, but then gradually improve it over time. So I guess starting off with a quick summary on why credit scores matter before diving into what makes up credit scores and what some of the suggestions that we have. Really a credit score, it's this 3-digit number that, if you think about it, lenders look at this 3-digit number as a way to assess, in part, how likely it is that you're going to repay that money, or how big of a risk you are in repaying that money. And this 3-digit number for your credit score is based on how you used debt and how you repaid money in the past. Uh, and also, look at a credit score, it impacts everything from getting a loan, approved yes or no, to what terms of the loan you're going to have, how long you have to repay the money, what your interest rate is. It can even affect renting an apartment or some industries landing a job. I always go back to my example here because in the finance industry, companies will run your credit report before hiring you because it would introduce, I suppose, additional risk. Me working in finance, if I had serious issues that the employer was concerned about. So the bottom line is your credit score does play a pretty big role in a bunch of different aspects of your financial life. Now, one of the things that comes into play with a credit score is just, I guess, understanding how you're being graded, for a lack of a better analogy. I equate it to I teach financial planning courses on the side just because I love teaching. And at the beginning of a semester, I always want to communicate to the students, hey, here's the assignments, here's how you're going to be judged, here's the rubrics. So that way they have a clear understanding of what the expectations are, as well as what matters and what doesn't matter. And in a way, understanding your credit score can do the same thing because it can help you understand what should I be concerned about versus what can I just not necessarily stress out about, because we have enough things in our not only our financial lives but our overall lives to stress out about. So the 5 key areas that impact someone's credit score are payment history, credit utilization, the length and mix of your credit, any sort of credit inquiries, and then derogatory marks. Now, in this page, they're ordered from most important to least important and how they affect someone's score. Until we get to the bottom, derogatory marks can have a pretty big impact. So payment history, at a high level, it's just looking, hey, is Brian paying his debts on time and in full every single month? And a good payment history, it starts at 100% and it only has one way to go, and that's down until eventually you could get it back up after a long enough period of time. So this is the most influential factor on your credit score. So a lot of times we will encourage people to automate their minimum bill payments as much as possible. So that way we reduce the chances of having a missed payment that then sticks on your credit report and impacts your credit score for years. Credit utilization is the next most important aspect of credit score. And really that's just kind of looking at saying, okay, what are your total credit card balances? How much are you using? And divide that number to get anywhere between, I suppose it could be between 0% and 100%. Really the line in the sand that is the first kind of threshold of saying we really want to get below this is 30%. We see a big drop in someone's score if they go from, let's say, 20% to 35% utilization. So maybe they have a $10,000 limit on their credit card. If they're at 3,500, that would start causing some issues with credit score. And as you pay it down, everything else stays the same, your credit score would improve. Length and mix of credit really just kind of looks at saying, how long have you had credit? What's the average age of all the different types of credit accounts you have open? So mortgage, student loan, personal loan, auto loan, credit cards, whatever it may be. And then do you have different types? And really what the credit bureaus are looking at here is if someone has a longer credit history, they've kind of established like, hey, I've paid and I've used credit responsibly for a longer period of time. So that may be less risk. And then if they have a mix of different types of credit, like maybe credit cards and student loans as opposed to just credit cards, then that mix would say, okay, they're used to using different types of credit. So that also would be viewed favorably. It's important, but it's not nearly as important as credit utilization or payment history. Credit inquiries would be when you go out and you actually apply for a loan or a credit card or different types of debt. So when you submit that formal application, they run your credit report. What happens is you'll see a slight decrease in your credit score, and then it'll gradually kind of come back up to normal after a few months, assuming you're paying your bills and everything. So this one is something that don't want a ton of credit inquiries, but the impact does go away pretty quickly. And then lastly, on the key components that affect someone's credit score would be derogatory marks. So think like bankruptcies or judgments or liens or different things like that. Typically, these have a pretty big effect on credit scores, and they can take a period of years in order to kind of eventually have a score rebound after that. Sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's 7 years, sometimes it's a little bit longer. So it really kind of depends on the circumstances there. So those are the key things to keep in mind here as far as like how you're being graded. Some of the simple things that we found that can be really, really helpful is just saying, okay, it's easier to avoid common mistakes that we come across than it is to make a mistake and then figure out how to improve your score. So the number one mistake to avoid is just missed or late payments. Sometimes this is unavoidable. So maybe it's, let's say it's a job loss or it's an emergency or something like that. Maybe it's working with a lender to find out what type of flexibility you have. Or everything's going smooth, it's automating payments as much as possible so we don't have as high of a risk of this type of thing happening. Sometimes people make the mistake of automatically just closing out old accounts. Sometimes it makes sense to close out old accounts. Sometimes it doesn't. But like, let's say when you pay off a credit card, your next step shouldn't automatically be, hey, I'm going to close this credit card, because that could affect your credit score in a couple different ways. It's really about kind of weighing the pros and the cons here. On the credit card note, sometimes people try to play the rewards game where they sign up and there's like a promo offer where if you spend a certain amount of money in the first like month or 3 months, you get bonus points. Sometimes that leads to really, really new or short credit length, and it could lead to overspending. So we see that being a big risk for people. Reviewing your credit report is another area that people sometimes forget to do. Best practice is probably once a year. You can work with a credit bureau. You can request a report for free. And a lot more people than I thought have mistakes on their credit report that hurt them that they didn't know were there until they went to apply for that mortgage. And they're like, oh, shoot, there's an error on my credit report that's hurting me. So I think just kind of like a good like spring cleaning type thing would be requesting that report once a year and saying, hey, is this right? Yes or no? What should I do with it? Along those lines, for people who are like, hey, I'm looking to buy a house or a car or one of those major purchase type items, generally speaking, you want to avoid taking on new debt along the way. Like, let's say, for example, you're closing on a house next month. You wouldn't want to take out a new credit card to buy the furniture right now, because that can actually affect whether or not you get approved for that loan. It won't always, cause an approval to turn into a decline, but it does happen from time to time, and it's one of those really unfortunate situations. And then the last area is in-store credit cards. Whether it be in-store or on-brand credit cards, if you shop online, this tends to be one of the types of credit cards that we see lead to the most risk, just with people forgetting they have them, with overspending on them or just taking too much of them out. The last thing that we encourage people to do is really monitor their credit score. It's something that has become very, very easy over the last few years with new technology platforms. So SoFi offers credit score monitoring. There's also third-party solutions out there. There's Credit Karma. There's all sorts of different institutions that you bank with that most likely offer some sort of credit score monitoring. And that could be really helpful because it helps you understand what your score is, what's helping, what's hurting your score, and then what you could focus on to improve your score if that's going to be a focus. And it kind of goes back to the idea of, what you track is ultimately going to be the thing that you change. So it just kind of creates that awareness. So that's the final area on credit score that we encourage people to do. Lastly, kind of connected to the credit score front, is helping people prioritize and manage debt. Now, we went through the 8 steps, and a couple of steps were related to debt. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because we have seen a lot more people going back and forth and struggling, especially with credit card debt, quite frankly, over the last 3 to 6 months, compared to, let's say, 5 years ago when I first started at SoFi. It's become a much bigger challenge for the people that we work with. So I wanted to dive into that just because it does seem to be a more frequent concern for people these days. So I guess kind of going back to the framework that we talked about, where debt was in 2 different spots. And the reason for that is because I don't think all debt is created equal. Now, I don't think anyone really likes owing money. And some people really don't like owing money, so it affects them emotionally. But if we're kind of taking a step back and looking at debt, I think we could look at it as good debt versus bad debt based on just drawing a line in the sand. And we draw that line in the sand at 7%, where we say if the interest rate on the debt is greater than 7%, we would consider that bad debt, and we would focus on that pretty early. If it's less than 7%, we would consider that good debt. It's relatively cheap to maintain compared to long-term returns in the market. Then we would kind of, I don't know, put that on the side until we accomplish other things in our finances. So that interest rate of over or under 7% just helps us figure out how big of a focus should this be and how should we prioritize this type of debt. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we have worked with people recently to really ultimately reduce the interest that they're paying on debt. And sometimes reducing interest can be extremely helpful, but full disclosure, it's not always going to be a magic bullet. It's something where if people have credit card debt, what we want to try to do is say, okay, let's make extra payments, and so that way we can ultimately kind of go after and pay down that credit card debt. But along the way, if there's ways that we could reduce interest on that credit card debt, then that's just going to help make that process a lot easier and a lot quicker. So some of the common ways that we've seen people reduce the interest that they pay on debt would be cash, investments, home equity, personal loans, and yes, even other credit cards. So kind of going through examples for all of these. On the cash side of things, it could be having more money in your checking and savings account than you should. So let's say if you have a couple months worth of expenses set aside in your checking account right now, but you also have credit card debt, maybe it's taking part of that and just using that to pay down the credit card balance because of the high interest rate. Not all of it, but at least taking part of it. The other area would be just, looking at cash flow every single month where, we reduce our expenses, we have a little bit of a cushion, we use that cushion to make extra payments on the credit cards. On the investment side of things, we've explored the idea of sometimes people have like taxable investments, like they're sitting there in their brokerage account or their non-qualified account. Is it worth selling some of those, depending on taxes and all that stuff, to pay down the credit card balance to save money on interest? Some people, maybe they can't or they don't want to sell their investments. They're able to take out a margin loan against those investments that typically comes with a much lower interest rate than a credit card, or even take out a 401k or a 403b loan that again comes with a lower interest rate than what the credit card would be. Now, the caveat here with taking out other types of debt that's lower interest to pay off a credit card is that, I guess, approach only works if you stop spending on the credit card, because otherwise you run the risk of having both, and that becomes a really big situation to solve for down the road. Some other areas for any homeowners on the call that may or may not have credit card debt, tapping into home equity can be a really powerful way to reduce the interest that you're paying on that debt. So it could be a home equity loan, or it could be a home equity line of credit. Generally, right now, it's not a cash out refinance. Excuse me. So it really is, hey, what different ways could we potentially tap into home equity? Again, just looking to reduce that interest, so that way we save a little bit of money. Personal loans, sometimes they're called debt consolidation loans. Those can also be used maybe for people that don't have investments or they don't have equity in their home. That could be a way to borrow money at a lower rate to pay off that credit card, or potentially balance transfer credit cards that come with lower interest rates than, let's say, rewards credit cards, to just make that whole process a little bit more efficient. That tends to be kind of towards the bottom of the priorities, just because you never want to place one credit card with another credit card, because that can kind of tempt people. But it can definitely be used to save some money on interest along the way. Perfect. So just kind of recapping before we hop over to any questions that may be coming in. Today we hit on the high level habits that we see really make an impact to people's finances, no matter what they're focusing on. Structuring their spending, focusing on one goal at a time, focusing on the right goal, and then really breaking that down into kind of short-term goals. We talked about the credit score, what matters, what doesn't. And then we had different ways to pay down credit card debt and ultimately save money on that. So now I'd love to open up to any questions that are coming in from the group.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Brian. So, folks, we will now open up the floor for questions from our audience. Please go ahead and post your questions in the comment and live chat sections, and we'll load them onto the stream for Brian to answer. So, Brian, before we go on to our audience questions, I do have some questions I'd like to ask you myself. So you went into in depth about the different kinds of debt, how to prioritize which kinds of debt. I did come across some other key terms that I'm curious about that I'm hoping you could give insight on. So, what's the difference between secured and unsecured debt? Because I've heard some debt being categorized into these categorizations.
Yeah, great question. Luckily, there's no shortage of acronyms or terms in the finance world. So there's a bunch of different ways to describe debt. Secured versus unsecured. Really, the easiest way to think about it is secured debt is backed by something. It could be your house, it could be your car, it could be your investments. Unsecured debt is not backed by anything. The lender is basically relying only on your ability to pay that money back. So typically we'll see like personal loans or credit cards. Most times secured debt comes with lower interest rates because the lender is taking on less risk, because in their mind, worst case scenario, they have something to fall back on. Whereas unsecured debt comes with higher rates because they only have the person to kind of fall back on. So it's a little bit riskier for them.
Gotcha. Thank you. And you also went into credit score very heavily in depth. But any tips on effectively building your credit score for those just starting out?
Yeah, for people that are just starting out, I think number one, monitoring your credit score, because I think it's a great place just to understand where you're strong and where you're weak. And a lot of times people that are just starting out, quite frankly, they're punished for something that they can't help because they don't have a time machine. So they can't go back and say, okay, I'm gonna, have long credit history and all this other stuff and payment history. So it's kind of accepting that. And then it could be sometimes it's using secured credit cards, especially for younger people, to build credit, where they typically come with lower balances, but it goes towards your credit history. It would be, really thinking long and hard before closing out old types of debt, because that only shortens your credit history.
Mm-hmm.
And then beyond that, it's going to be exercising patience for that average age of credit to increase, or your credit limits to increase. So that way your score will kind of increase over time.
Gotcha. Thank you. And kind of going off of that, another kind of like second part of that question, I've heard potential people being added as authorized users to another person's credit account, contributing to the authorized user's credit history as well. Is that an effective way of building it up, do you think, or any insight?
Yeah, we'll see a lot of parents do that, quite frankly, where they'll add their kids once they reach 18 as authorized users, because that could help, where it helps out the average age of credit. It helps out on the credit utilization. It can help on payment history. It's really important to keep in mind, though, that also goes both ways. So like let's say I'm a parent, I fast forward to when my kids are older. If I miss a payment and I add my kid as an authorized user, that will hurt them. So it will go both ways, and they're able to handle any sort of negative things. It's a lot tougher for them to handle it when they're just starting than it is for someone who has established credit. So that's the one thing we throw out there is it can be incredible, but you just want to make sure that you know it can go both ways.
Right, for sure. All right, thank you. So on to our audience questions. This one was earlier in the webinar. So our audience member asks, though the 50-30-20 is a widely known rule, isn't it also dependent on one's age? For example, for a person at age 20, their spending on necessities can be less than 50.
Yeah, I think it certainly will depend on someone's age. And even within the same age, it'll depend on what they have going on in their finances. So let's say someone who has, for example, someone graduates with a ton of student loan debt. Sometimes their essential expenses, there's no way to keep them below 50%. Whereas sometimes maybe the same age group, they don't have a lot of things that they have to pay for. So their essential expenses are way lower. In my mind, the most important number is the 20%. I think eventually people can get to a point where they just focus on the 80-20 approach, where personally, I just have a spending target. I know how much I can spend every month in order to hit that 20% target. And that's all I focus on is my progress towards that 80%. The 50-30-20 kind of breakdown just adds a little bit of context to help
Mm,
people as they're figuring out how to kind of spread out their money.
gotcha. And there was a second part to that question. Is there any rule that takes into account the age on top of what you just mentioned?
Yeah, I don't think a really hard and fast rule. I think a lot of it is going to depend because there's going to be people who are younger that maybe they don't have as many essential expenses. In my mind, that's a perfect opportunity to actually have more than 20% going towards their goals. Because if I can go back in time and look at it before I had kids and a house and all these things that kind of come out, it was easier for me to save money back then, and that would have been nice to get that head start. Or sometimes there's people later in life who life, quite frankly, happens, and they couldn't save enough throughout their 20s, 30s, 40s. Maybe, quite frankly, in order to retire, they have to save a lot more. So I think there's always going to be adjustments to it depending on kind of where you're at in your financial journey.
Gotcha. Hope that answered your question. Next question. Can you please share some investment options for someone on the J1 visa? And I believe that's the exchange visitor program. So I'm guessing not staying or staying temporarily in the U.S. Any insight on that?
Yeah, so honestly, different financial institutions are gonna have different rules for how you like who can open accounts. As far as let's say opening up a brokerage account for investments and things like that. So I would certainly kind of talk to different financial institutions, but generally speaking, depending on what the plan is, a lot of time, or even eligibility to like retirement plans or qualified plans like IRAs, that's where it becomes a lot more complicated. But for after tax, like brokerage accounts, typically it's going to depend on the financial institution.
Gotcha. And next question from the same audience member. If someone recently came to the US, how can he build his credit score?
Yeah, I think that would be somewhat similar to the earlier response as far as building credit score, where I think it may be more relying, especially early on let's say secured credit cards as opposed to an unsecured credit card. So a secured credit card is really just it's kind of like a debit card type of concept where you make a security deposit, but it reports to the credit bureaus. So because it's like a debit card where you have a security deposit, lenders are much more likely to give them out to people. So that can be a really good way for people along the way, or especially early on in the journey, building their credit score.
Gotcha. And also like to point out one statement from my colleague Lynn Copeland, who's tuning in. Thank you, Lynn. A bad credit score can also influence your risk for car insurance. Apparently, it correlates to how responsible a person you are. I can imagine that is true. Uh, can't really have insurance or a car if you're not responsible with it. So thank you for that, Lynn. This next question from our audience member, John. John asks, if I haven't had or needed a loan or mortgage in a long time and have no debt, just rent, does this negatively impact my score? And does it make sense to have some debt just to maintain a good credit rating?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the most common criticisms we get about credit scores outside of the fact that it kind of punishes you early on because you just haven't had the time to build it up, is if you don't have credit or you don't need credit. Um, so you wouldn't have your average age of credit would be really low, if anything. Credit utilization would probably be really low, if anything. So that could come into play and negatively affect your credit score. I think whether or not it makes sense to maintain, let's say, a credit card, I think it very well could, just because you never know if you may need to access credit in the future. Having a solid credit score allows some flexibility. So one thing that people do a lot of times is they'll just have credit cards open where, if you make, small payments on these credit cards, or maybe it's streaming services or your gas or whatever, and you automatically pay it off in full every month, you're not going to pay interest on it. So it's just like using cash, except for it's building credit. And depending on the credit card, you could get some rewards points too. So that could be a really easy way that doesn't really cost anything to build credit and keep a good credit score, even if you don't need debt.
Gotcha. Well, John, hope that answers your question. And thanks for the question. Our next question. Can't see who posted it, but I believe it's our audience viewer, Anne. With mortgage rates rising to slash over 7%, does the idea that the 7% equals bad debt change? And don't tax advantages outweigh the percentage rate? For example, if mortgage rate equals 7%, but auto loan 6.5, would you still pay more towards mortgage first?
Yeah, this is a great question, especially because I would say probably like once a month or so, the team of financial planners that I work with, we debate this. We've been debating this for like 3 or 4 months, quite frankly. As financial nerds, this is like a riveting topic for us. So I think it does, because a mortgage, to the point, mortgage can come with tax benefits, depending on how you file taxes. So that's one reason. The other reason that I would say, if let's say a mortgage is like 7.2% or 7.3%, the amount of time it would take for someone to pay off that mortgage is typically a long time, because a mortgage tends to be a very large debt. So it delays a lot of those other things. So I think there's always exceptions to the 7% rule. Whether or not we would change it to 7.5%, 8%, I don't know if that would happen. Some context for why we use the 7% rule is 7% is the long-term historical return of the stock market adjusted for inflation. And we kind of use that as a baseline to say, what's the opportunity cost if we have an extra $100 of, okay, if our debt is more expensive than long-term returns in the market, then the best place for that would be the debt. If our debt interest rate or the debt cost is lower than that, then it would be better to invest it. And that's where that 7% rule came from. So I could see it potentially changing, and there's always exceptions to it.
Hope that answers your question, Anne. Thanks, Brian. Anne also asks another question. Do home equity line loans require the proceeds to be used towards home improvements, or do cash out refinancing require the extra money to be used towards home improvements? I thought some type of home loan required the money to be put back into the house, but maybe I'm misremembering.
Yeah, good question. So generally speaking, home equity loans or home equity lines of credit, or using cash out refinance, there would not be that requirement. I've seen home equity used for a variety of different things. So there wouldn't be that requirement. There are some requirements related to specific home improvement loans. I've seen some FHA home improvement loans that have those requirements, and then even like specific companies where it truly is a standalone home improvement loan. But for the most part, no. You could use that for home improvements. I've seen people use it for, um, quite frankly, funding IVF to have a family, paying off credit card debt, different things like that.
Gotcha. Thank you, Brian. And I believe that's it for our audience questions. So since we are close to the end of the hour, Brian, I have one last question that I'd like to ask you. It's probably one you've been asked quite a bit, but why should people utilize financial planners?
Yeah, I think the biggest reason people should use financial planners is to help in the process of planning. And that sounds obvious, but I think a financial plan, in my mind, isn't all that valuable because it's going to change the second you kind of leave the office or you leave the online meeting. But the process of planning is very important in having a discussion on what's important to you, what concerns do you have, and how do you kind of prioritize different aspects of your financial life. And I think a good financial planner helps do that. So I think it's important to have a good relationship with them and that they're qualified.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, folks, unfortunately, we are out of time. I know we could go on and on about this because financial planning and management is incredibly important. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today and for the insight you've provided our audience on how to approach and prioritize their finances to manage debt. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Also, apologies, I'm trying to get this one thing off our screen. All right. And thank you to our audience members for tuning in and for your great questions. Our fourth and final webinar in the financial literacy series in partnership with IEEE member discounts will be on Wednesday, April 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Let me just put that on the screen for you all. The registration link will be provided shortly in the comment section as well and in the follow-up email that we send out to our audience and registrants. Did you know that IEEE members can take advantage of exclusive and discounted pricing on insurance and a variety of products and services that can add up to substantial savings? Discover what IEEE member discounts can offer you. Before we close it off, I'd like to provide our audience an update on our IEEE USA 50th anniversary celebration cruise going on in October of this year, presented by IEEE member group insurance program. Cabins are running low with our suite level cabins close to selling out. The cruise will feature exclusive events, food, and live entertainment, along with an informative and insightful, multiple informative and insightful lightning sessions on a variety of topics. We invite everyone to join, but do recommend booking your cabin soon before it's too late. On that note, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe to our channels on social media, and check back daily for future live stream updates. Have a great day, everyone.